Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Palmer. Tonight I'm speaking with Eric Holt-Giménez, Director of Food First. Eric.
Good evening. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Well, I spent some time on the website today and I learned a bit about your organization, and I hadn't realized how far back your roots go.
Yeah, we were started about 36 years ago by an extraordinary woman named Frances Moore Lepay, who wrote what at the time was a revolutionary book called Diet for a Small Planet. And she said two things then that I remember from reading the book back then, which are still true today. And the first thing she said is that we have hunger in the world, not because of scarcity. In fact, we have more than 1.5 times enough food to feed every man, woman, and child on the planet. And the next thing she said was, we are going to have to learn to eat further down the food chain if we don't expect to destroy our environment. And those two things are still true today.
This book sold 2 million copies at the time.
Yeah.
It's still in print.
Well, I wish we had the rights to it. We've done over 30 books since then. And Hunger 12 Myths was another one that Frances Moore Lepay did with Peter Rossett. And we've done books about Cuba, books about the Zapatistas. Our last few books have been about food sovereignty. We did a book called Food Rebellions, Crisis and the Hunger for Justice, about the food crisis of 2008. And we've just finished a book, an edited book called Food Movements Unite, which is a compilation with 19 different authors from around the world talking about how can we unite and converge in all of our diversity to become a powerful food movement, powerful enough to transform the present food system.
And the present food system is a corporate system.
The present food system is a disaster for most people in the world. Many people like to think of the food system as broken because we have the stuffed and starved, as my friend Raj Patel says. We have 1 billion stuffed and 1 billion starved on the planet. And it's an extremely destructive food system, and one in which tremendous amount of power is concentrated in the hands of just a few corporations. But I don't really see the food system as broken. I see the food system as acting precisely as a food system during a period of late capitalism would be expected to act. It concentrates power in the hands of a few monopolies, and it externalizes all the costs onto society. And those are very expensive costs. With 1 billion people going hungry, and with 50 million people in the United States food insecure. The richest country in the world, we produce more food than anybody else except China, and yet we still have 50 million hungry people. So you can see right away, this isn't a problem of that there's not enough food, but it's the wrong kind of food, it's produced the wrong way, and it's making us sick, and it's starving a sixth of the population.
So distribution is, of course, a big part of it.
Well, distribution is a big part of it, but I think you have to look at the whole system. So, from seed to plate. And it's not just distribution, it's the models of production and of processing, and it's how labor is treated in the food system. The people in the food system that have the worst food security are the ones who work in the food industry, starting with the farm workers and the people who work in the processing plants, right down to the people who work in the restaurants, have the worst wages and the worst food security of the entire population. So this is really a dysfunctional type of food system. And we have to ask, how did we get here? And what can we do about it? And that's what Food First does. We like to call ourselves a people's think tank, a think and do tank, because we generate information and analysis that tries to get to the root, goes to the core. And in that sense, we're a radical think tank. We go to the root, and we generate publications and policy briefs and development reports and backgrounders and whatnot that try to do two things. One, we try to inform the general public about the root causes of the dysfunctionality of our food system. And we also try to amplify the voices of the social movements who are working to change the food system, both here in the United States and abroad. We have projects on the ground. We have projects on the ground in Africa, in Latin America, and right here in Oakland.
You give tours.
We also give tours. We have a program called Food Sovereignty Tours, where we take people to Bolivia, to Oaxaca, to Cuba, to the Basque Country, and we've got a tour coming up to Italy, where we're going to go to an event called Terra Madre with slow food. And what we try to do is put people directly in contact with the communities and the social movements that are trying to change things, both in very practical ways and also in political ways. Because what's wrong with the food system are the rules, the institutions and the rules of what we call the corporate food regime. There have been about 3 food regimes through history. And a food regime is, think of a set of institutions and rules on a world scale which govern production and consumption. So we go back to the colonial period, and we had a food regime in which the countries of the global south produced cheap food and raw materials so that the global north could cheaply industrialize. Then after World War II, the flow of food is reversed because the countries of the global north begin to overproduce, and they don't really know what to do with all their food. So they basically export it to the global south. But the global south already has its own food. So they have to destroy the markets in the global south, break them down to resolve their crisis of overproduction. And that's where the U.S. institutes food aid, for example. And so very cheap food, subsidized production, produces very cheap food in the north, which is then funneled and dumped into the global south. And of course, the farmers down there can't compete. And then we move into the third food regime, which is the corporate food regime, when we have all these free trade agreements and structural adjustment, which basically destroys the capacity for food production in the global south, makes it dependent upon the north for its food. And then you have this very complicated moving around of capital and corporations. So it's not just a north-south thing anymore. So for example, the largest processing plant for soybeans in the world is in Brazil. And it's owned by Cargill, which is a private U.S. corporation. And this type of, the largest employer in the food industry in the world is Walmart. In Mexico and for example, it's the largest employer. So it's much more complicated now. But what we see are these tremendous market power in the hands of just a few corporations that control the seeds and the grain. And
it's like
the
the
meat
power
production.
is moving from the states to the corporations. The corporations are controlling the flow of food more and have more power.
Absolutely. And this is, over the last 20 years, we've seen sort of the neoliberalization of our food system along with the neoliberalization of everything, which just basically means a move towards privatization of all resources, of all public spaces, of all public goods, and then the commercialization, and then the financialization of all this. So one of the drivers of the 2008 and 2011 food crises, in which we went from about 900 million to 1 billion hungry people, was speculation with food. And so it happened at Wall Street. It happened with Goldman Sachs. They drove the price of food up so high that poor people couldn't afford it. So it wasn't that there wasn't any food. In fact, in 2008 and again in 2011, we had record harvests The world had never produced so much food in its entire history. But we had record hunger. But we also had record profits. So we had things like 1,200% increase in profits, quarterly profits, from Cargill's subsidiary of Mosaic Fertilizer. Now there were other drivers, like the price of oil went up. We turned a lot of our grain into fuel, right, which makes the price of food go up and whatnot. But these are all proximate causes. I mean, the root causes are that we have a very dysfunctional food system which is highly vulnerable to both environmental and economic shock. And you would think that these shocks are bad, and they are for most of the world, but they're very lucrative for the corporations who make these record profits on the basis of this tremendous volatility.
When you have a monopoly, you make money either way.
That's right. Market goes down, you buy up. Market goes up, you sell. So, and this is what we're faced with today, is how to dismantle the tremendous monopoly power of these corporations. And unfortunately, our government is completely complicit with these corporations. So the changes are going to have to come from below. And that's why it's so important to understand what food movements are doing. And our latest book, Food Movements Unite, attempts to do exactly that. We call upon food movement leaders from right here in Oakland all the way to Brazil with the landless workers movement, and ask them, what is to be done? How do we converge in all of our diversity? And what they have to say is, this isn't easy. If it was, we'd have already done it. In fact, no one knows how to do this. We need to invent new forms of political organization because the old ones are not serving us anymore. Capitalism has changed, and the old forms of organization, which brought us the 40-hour work week, women's suffrage, public schooling, and public health, all these tremendous things.
Indoor plumbing. What have you.
What have you. But these forms of organization are no longer effective. And so we have to find new forms. So we've become much more diverse as social movements, and but very fragmented at the same time, and to some degree very depoliticized. So the big challenge is now, how do we converge, and how do we repoliticize our movements? And there are some lessons out there, and some trends to follow. And one of the lessons is right here, a historical lesson that we have in Oakland, which was with the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party were the first to establish a nationwide breakfast program for children, which embarrassed the US government because the government wasn't really doing it. And the Panthers fed 250,000 kids every day. And they did it without a penny from the government and without a penny from philanthropy. They did it with food from their own communities. And they really started what we now call food sovereignty, which is the democratization of the food system in favor of the poor. And the Panthers had a philosophy called revolution, it was called survival pending revolution. Now they call it survival pending transformation. But basically you had to deal with these very immediate issues of survival as you work to change the system. And what's very interesting about the Panthers was that they had the 10-point platform, which addressed health, education, and welfare. And food was just one plank in a larger platform of liberation. And I think that's what's happening today. We see the food justice movement in the United States, which is attempting to dismantle the racism in the food system, because people of color and poor people are most negatively impacted by this food system. Have the highest level of diet-related diseases, epidemic levels of diet-related diseases. And in the Global South, we had the food sovereignty movement, largely led by the peasantry, fishers, pastoralists, who are trying to roll back the onslaught of the corporations, which are steadily pushing them off their land and separating them from their food-producing resources. So it's very much about, we need our resources to produce food and control our own food systems. And both.
That is a big part of the battle, is holding on to your land. A lot of these corporate interests are pushing people off the land for minerals, for for aluminum, for multiple reasons.
Well, for water
Yeah,
and for real estate.
right.
Quite frankly, that's where the speculation comes in. I mean, not just the food companies, but the food companies especially made windfall profits in 2008 and again in 2011. And because of the financial crisis and the recession, they have nowhere to invest these profits, and they have to. They have a crisis of accumulation. So we see them engaging in enormous land grabs throughout the global south. And we see them here in urban areas basically moving back in to underserved communities, buying up land cheap, ostensibly to address the problem of food deserts. But in fact, what they're doing is they need a place to put their wealth, and so they're buying up the land. Because if we were really concerned about food deserts, we have, a half a dozen to a dozen organizations right here in Oakland, local organizations, that if they were given a chance and a little bit of capital and a little bit of investment, would set up corner stores throughout the neighborhoods. And that food dollar would stay in the neighborhood where it could recycle up to 5 times. And the food system could be an engine for local economic growth. But instead we have, Walmart coming in or Kroger's coming in, and these are extractive industries. They suck the food dollar right out of the community and in exchange provide some bad food.
Seems like it's always the battle against the large. It's the small against the large, and the large always have the advantage of scale, of abstract reasoning, of technology, and the small are always at a terrible disadvantage. But when it comes to local primal needs like food, it seems like some of those dynamics change.
Well, I think we have to remember that just being large doesn't mean that you're more efficient. And in fact, large monocultural plantation farms, corn, wheat, soy, etc., produce much less per acre than small farms that have polycultures, all kinds of different crops growing together. Those farms produce much more in terms of pounds per acre. They use more labor. But they produce less greenhouse gases, and they use less petroleum. And at the end of the day, they're much more efficient in terms of the energy cost, and they're much more efficient in terms of employing labor, which now is a problem. We need to employ people. And so just because bigger has an advantage in terms of scale politically and in terms of market power, it doesn't mean it's necessarily more efficient in terms of use of resources and basically supplying incomes for livelihoods. You look, for example, and that's true here and it's true throughout the world, you look at 100 hectares of mixed farming systems in Brazil. You can have 17 families on that land. But you convert that to monocultural soy or sugarcane, and you're providing 2 jobs at slave wages. Right? So, obviously what happens is you get this tremendous sort of extractive concentration of wealth through through an industrial system like this. And I think that the thing about Food First is, we study this day in and day out. It gets very depressing. What happens, though, is that because we work so closely with social movements and with people for whom losing hope is just not an option, it's also very inspiring work, because one can see that, in fact, it's the people with the least who are doing the most to create change. And we have tremendous opportunities for alliances and for really building power between rural and urban movements, and between the North and the South, and across divides of race and class and gender. And that's precisely what we're beginning to see.
Food movements unite.
Food movements unite, absolutely. We see this now today in Brazil. Is the Rio Plus 20 summit, and so this is supposed to be about the green economy. And basically, what we had were two summits. We had the official summit, which is the United Nations summit, which has really been taken over by the large environmental organizations and the corporations, who basically, their plan to save nature is to sell it.
Commodify it.
If you can commodify it, then you can save it, seems to be the philosophy.
Put a value on it.
Put a value on it.
Then people will care about it.
People will care about it. But what's happened, of course, is that by turning nature into a commodity and opening up carbon markets and this type of thing, we've unleashed fierce corporate competition for the remaining resources on the earth. That's what's happened. So it's not cooperation, it's competition. And it's competition by, it's quite unfair competition. We need these giants. How are poor peasants in isolated villages supposed to compete with Cargill and the like? So there's a counter summit called the People's Summit, which has basically denounced the green economy and said, no, we have to protect our environment, and we have to protect our people as well. They're part of the environment. And we don't need a lot of technologies like genetic engineering, which are not particularly effective, actually, and at raising yields or for climate resiliency. What we need is agroecology, these diversified farming systems, which are quite resilient. And we need to rebuild our local food economies. We need to keep people on the land, not push them off. And in fact, that's how we can store carbon and cool the planet.
I'm sure you are, but to what level do you agree with people like James Hansen that we're going to see desertification of our major fertile belts in the north and south, and that our major, even business as usual, will collapse eventually, and we could see a wholesale collapse of our food system?
Well, if we continue down this path with industrial agriculture, we certainly will, and we're already beginning to see the indications. I mean, the genetic engineering, which promised us so much, is now beginning to unravel. So Roundup-ready corn from Monsanto has produced superweeds, and we have an invasion of pigweed across the southwestern United States, which Monsanto has tried to combat by applying more, and now by bringing back 2,4-D, an Agent Orange, into our fields. We're supposed to be applying less herbicides, not more. That was the promise. Well, it hasn't worked because weeds develop resistance. Insects develop a resistance to Bt corn, which is now genetically injected into our corn. And so now that doesn't work either. So it's beginning to fall apart, quite frankly, and Monsanto and Syngenta and Bayer cannot keep up.
So regardless of warming, it's going to fall apart anyway?
Well, it is both fueling warming. Industrial agriculture is the largest single contributor to global warming. About 30% of greenhouse gases come from nitrous oxide and carbon in industrial agriculture, and methane from the feedlots. So we basically have to dismantle industrial agriculture and replace it with agriculture that actually cools the planet. And we know what that is. And this is extensively documented and in scientific journals that have been peer-reviewed. And I myself lived for 25 years on the ground with farmers' movements in Latin America and saw this happen. The alternatives exist. The question is, are we going to allow them to move from being alternatives to becoming the norm? And I think to do that, we have to change the rules. We have to stop subsidizing industrial agriculture. Because what industrial agriculture does is it takes the subsidy and then it gives us the costs. So we basically subsidize it on two sides, right? On production and then post-production with all the environmental externalities, we have to pay them again. So we've got to dismantle that. It's much too expensive, and the ultimate cost is, the warming of the planet and the destruction of agricultural systems worldwide. So we have to make this transition, but to do that we have to change the rules. And to that we have to change the institutions. The World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, USAID, the Farm Bill. These are the institutions and the rules which govern the world's agricultural systems. Now, there's some good news in all of this, which, for example, is that most of the world's food is not globalized, doesn't cross borders, and but it is at a disadvantage in the marketplace, the way the marketplace is structured. So we could change that very easily, and so that industrial agriculture and agribusiness does not have the market advantage anymore, which has been constructed. This isn't a free market. It never was. The other good news is that there are about 2 billion smallholders in the world. That hasn't changed for many, many years. The percentage of rural and urban has changed, but in absolute numbers, the earth has the same number of smallholders, peasants, and family farms that it has had for 100 years or so. So, and they're incredibly productive. They already feed over half the world. What we have to do is give them a chance. In the global south, the countryside has to be made a better place to live. You need roads and schools and health clinics, and farmers need more land. It's impossible to make a living on a half a hectare of land or on 2 acres of land. You can't feed your family. We need more land. Unfortunately, what's happening is the opposite. There's land grabs by the large corporations and by speculators taking the land away and shoving peasants onto smaller and smaller parcels of land. We have to stop that. We have to reverse the direction. And we probably need land reform. And in this country, land is concentrating. Throughout the Midwest, land is concentrating again. We've got to turn that around. We've got to be redistributing land. We've got to be putting people back on the land. Even Europe has much better re-entry programs and young farmer programs, and attempting to resolve part of the crisis around unemployment by getting people back onto the land. We could be doing that here as well. And I think that as the food movement becomes stronger, and particularly as more and more consumers understand that it's not just about getting organic food or local food or designer food onto your plate. It's about changing the structure of agriculture and changing the structure of the food system.
Well, Eric, we have about a minute left. How could a viewer help participate in that? If they're in an urban environment, what can they do?
Well, I think that we can all do something. And Grace Lee Boggs says, when you don't know what to do, plant a garden. So plant a garden. And immediately you will enter into a community of people who are trying to change the food system. So that would be the first step I would recommend. And then comes the second step, well, let's maybe sell at a farmer's market. Oh, we don't have one. Well, let's start one. And then maybe the third step, which might be, well, it looks like we need a community-supported agriculture to connect producers and consumers directly. And then maybe the fourth step would be, we really need more small retail stores, family-owned stores in our neighborhoods, spread around our neighborhoods, so that we have fresh food and the food dollar stays in the community. And then maybe it's, well, let's join a food policy council. We've got one in Oakland and we've got one in Berkeley. Let's join those. Let's change the rules right here where we can change them.
Very good. Well, Eric Holt-Giménez, Executive Director for Food First, thank you so much for coming here and telling us about your work.
Thanks for having me.
All right. And thank you for joining us. Good night.